Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the, 10th pre-performance talk. You might notice that I'm not in the programme, but I've nonetheless managed to muscle in on interviewing David Hare. This is also the 27th of the spoken word events that are about contextualising and celebrating the productions that are part of this 50th anniversary season. Now, tonight is a slightly different one, in that obviously there is no author still alive to interview, and there is no director or star. So we are incredibly lucky to have David Hare to talk about Heartbreak House, George Bernard Shaw's own favourite play. David wrote the introduction to the Penguin edition. But before we start that, I'm just going to obviously give you a little bit of background about David, not that you need it. Do you need it? No, but you're going to, look, I've done it, so you're going to have it. That's the point. Of course, David Hare is one of our most important playwrights, authors, theatre director, film director, screenwriter. Amongst many, many wonderful things he's done, is one of the co-founders of Joint Stock Theatre Company, an associate director of the National Theatre, and the author of some 27 plays, beginning with Slag in 1970. And I think Chichester's very proud of the fact that the most recent one was South Downs in the wonderful season last year. Exactly. There have, of course, been 6 of David's plays presented at Chichester, including Racing Demon, the first one of the extraordinary trilogy about the state of Britain and institutions, and, of course, The Blue Room, which had 1 or 2 gentlemen. Well, we won't go there. But more importantly, last year, David was awarded the Penn Pinter Prize, and Lady Antonia Fraser, when talking about the prize, said that David was someone who always spoke out fearlessly on the subject of politics in its broadest sense. So it seems very appropriate that we are lucky enough today to have David Hare to talk about Bernard Shaw's Heartbreak House. David.
Yes, it is a long play, a frightfully long play. If the spectators interrupt and delay the proceedings in the usual manner, they will spoil the performance, and they will not be out of the theatre until 3 a.m. We shall get through in time for the last trains, if they will let us. If not, let them pay for taxis or walk home, and serve them right. And as I ran the other night for the 10:40 train back to London, and finally got to Victoria at 10 to 1, I did slightly think that George Bernard Shaw was a little flippant in his first description of this play, that he sort of forbids you to laugh because it will slow it up, you know. It doesn't seem to be the audience's fault if they laugh at the play. And obviously, it's a play that has occupied my heart, I suppose. I don't think... to me, one of the most moving images of Englishness of all time is that idea that between 1914 and 1918, it was possible for people who lived in this area to sit and at night hear the war going on in the Somme, and that Shaw sat in a house called Wyndham Croft, which was Virginia Woolf's house in Sussex, and that he could sit there and actually at night hear the fighting. And it's a fantastically evocative image that I suppose then spurred the play. And the play tries to tell you what the 20th century is going to be like. I don't know how many people have yet seen the play, so I don't want to discuss it in too much detail for fear of spoiling it for people who haven't. But it tells you what he believes is coming. And nobody can say that he was wrong about what was coming. In other words, violence is, he believes, the future. The play, I don't think I'm spoiling it for anybody to say that towards the end of the play, there is a presentiment of war. And then the other thing that the play centrally is about is us all being turned into lazy consumers who, in that wonderful phrase that he has, we shall eat, but we shall not live. And it's really about Shaw's fear that everybody is being turned into mulch and pap, and that everybody is just being turned into big mouths, mouths that receive, not mouths that speak, and that's what the 20th century is going to be like, and that some essential feistiness and fight and vigour is going to go out of the British as the 20th century proceeds. And for someone who is meant to be a socialist playwright, it's obviously a very conflicted view, which is one of the things that makes the play so wonderful, I think, is that it isn't a simple Fabian view of what is coming in the 20th century. It's a view full of fear about what's going to happen to people in the future. And I can't do any better than read what I wrote for Penguin. I'm going to start by doing that, and I'm going to then turn to Kate and ask her to ask me some questions, and then I think we're going to ask some questions. But really what I wrote for Penguin says what I feel about the play, which for me is a very, very important and beloved play to me. I start the essay with the fact that Shaw is rarely performed, but I have to deal with the fact that at Chichester, Shaw is performed, which is a mystery of programming that I don't wholly understand. And it's anomalous in terms of the British theatre at large. There's a long history of Shaw at, of course, I think it comes from Tyrone Guthrie. I think it comes from the whole tradition of this building, which was a copy of, not a copy, but it was derived from the experiment with the thrust stage. I think Guthrie was a great proponent of Shaw. Shaw is played in Canada, where there are other theatres of this shape and size. And I think Shaw is felt to be able to cope with the scale of these kind of houses and is popular in them. But he is very little played, and the National Theatre has attempted to revive him, successfully in the case of St. Joan, since I wrote this 10 years ago. And I think they're doing The Doctor's Dilemma this year.
Yes.
But if you go to a regional theatre now, by and large, Shaw is something you will rarely expect to see. Pygmalion, maybe. But the bread and butter plays are rarely revived now. In the confident days of post-war expansion, most British theatre companies were able to rotate the same classic authors to make up a dependable repertoire of plays, which someone once wittily christened brochure theatre. At your local theatre, you could expect to see Shakespeare performed alongside a regular team of authors who usually included Harold Pinter, Ibsen, and Arthur Miller. But more recently, as regional theatres have suffered disastrously from public underfunding, and as the comfortable literary consensus which underpinned their choices has disappeared, so artistic directors have needed to adopt a bolder and more improvised approach to creating a modern repertory. Some famous writers have continued to thrive. Anton Chekhov's 4 best-known plays are still relentlessly revived. Oscar Wilde's work seems only to grow in popularity. But the most eminent victim of this enforced shakedown has been the problematic figure of George Bernard Shaw. Sometimes it is as if we no longer know what to do with him. On the publication of the final volume of Michael Holroyd's brilliant 3-part biography in 1992, then several reviewers noted how unfortunate it was that in the 15 years it had taken Holroyd to write the book, it had coincided with the irreversible decline in his subject's reputation. It would be hard, they insisted, to imagine a playwright more thoroughly out of fashion. Shaw, for all his staggering longevity and range, was, even by the time of his death in 1950, still associated with an era of rational Fabianism, which no longer spoke to the modern world. His brand of pioneering socialism no longer spoke to a civilization grazing contentedly on the excesses of the free market. Moreover, his plays, with their notorious long sentences and stagey attitudinizing, embodied a fearful approach to sex, which our own more full-blooded age found spinsterish and immature. The characters were authorial mouthpieces, puppets, not people. The playwright, once described as the creator of modern consciousness, seemed, in the way of many things new, to have become a victim of the fact that he had so completely dominated his own time. He had, in short, been superseded. If these reviewers had looked a little bit harder, they would have found that their supposed reassessments of Shaw more truly reflected the doubts which some audiences and critics had enjoyed about his work from the very beginning. The character of Shaw himself had always commanded an interest and authority far wider than any of the plays he actually wrote. As a man, he was offered $1 million on his deathbed to impart a last message to an American news magazine. That was a measure of his extraordinary celebrity. He declined. But as a playwright, he was well used to being singled out for special abuse. When, in 1977, the critic of The Guardian, Michael Billington, casually referred to Shaw as the greatest British dramatist since Shakespeare, then John Osborne, at that time one of our leading British playwrights, unleashed an extraordinary attack on his dead colleague, accusing Michael Billington of suffering, quote, a critical brainstorm, as well as perpetuating an exam-crazy classroom myth. Shaw is the most fraudulent, inept writer of Victorian melodramas ever to gull a timid critic or fool a dull public. He writes like a Pakistani who has learned English when he was 12 years old in order to become a chartered accountant. From childhood, I have read these plays, toured as an actor and stage manager in them on one-night stands. Apart from this experience, any writer I know would put his finger on the crass, vulgar drivel in any of them. Try learning them, Mr. Billington. They are posturing wind and rubbish. In short, just the kind of play you would expect a critic to write. The difference is simply, he did it. It is clear that any playwright who attracts this kind of impassioned censure from one of his most distinguished successors is not just suffering a temporary dip in reputation. He is, I suggest, attempting a kind of play so crazily ambitious that some people are bound to object even to the very endeavour. A playwright who makes remarks like, you see things and say why, but I dream things and say why not, is always going to divide people. Some will find him inspiring, but others will think him pretentious. For if Heartbreak House is, as its author suggested, his King Lear, then it has to be admitted that it has, from the very first presentation, suffered a far more mixed press than Shakespeare's accepted masterpiece. Billed, perhaps misleadingly, as a fantasia in the Russian manner on English themes, I personally don't see the connection with Chekhov in this play at all, apart from the fact it takes place in a house. Heartbreak House played at the Royal Court in Shaw's own 1921 production at over 4 hours. Shaw seems to have not been very surprised when the play then attracted a level of dismissive vituperation which not even his recent detractors could hope to emulate. From the outset, then, Shaw's occasionally unwieldy attempt to mix high farce with prophecy and with divine tragedy, and to marble an apparent comedy of manners with grave presentiments of an impending catastrophe, have brought out an anger and exasperation in some spectators which has never truly abated. But for some of us, Heartbreak House remains, not just alongside Pygmalion, Shaw's most likeable and profound play, but also a work which has extraordinary historic importance. Heartbreak House is frequently revived and much admired by working actors and directors precisely because it is the century's original State of England play. If anything has distinguished the British theatre in the last 100 years, it has been its continual and refreshing willingness to make art not just from private subjects, grief, love, family, jealousy, but also from public issues. In particular, it is the theatre which has sought to dramatise the peculiar and tragic national trajectory of the period. If the theatre has seemed in this period to be the most adult of all British literary forms, then it is surely because it has not been frightened to stray into areas of social structure and public policy. It is this genre of play, originated by Heartbreak House and since pioneered by dozens of writers, including Harley Granville Barker, J.B. Priestley, and indeed John Osborne himself, which has given 20th century British drama so much zip, and which has led to the international conviction, still largely valid, that the theatre, alongside painting, is one of the two art forms at which the British truly excel. In gathering together a collection of Bloomsbury-like bohemians in a Sussex house, the play sets off in a familiar Chekhovian direction, analysing the state of the nation and its dangerous indifference to its own fate by portraying the life and loves of a representative group of middle-class people. Shaw looks ahead to the coming century and sees it as no friendly place for romantics or adventurers, but belonging instead to a new class of depressing capitalists who are determined to reduce life to its lowest common denominator. Who can say he was wrong? Yet even in this overall scheme, so uncannily prophetic about the world we now live in, Captain Shotover, let it be noted, is working on Ronald Reagan's Star Wars strategy, the weapon which will destroy all other weapons. There is a wildness of texture, a sheer strangeness of vision, which is often so personal and peculiar that we may almost rub our ears in danger of disbelieving what we have heard. Many commentators have rightly drawn attention to the zaniness of Shaw's humour. It should be clear by now, says Bertolt Brecht, that Shaw is a terrorist. The Shavian terror is an unusual one, and he employs an unusual weapon, that of humour. Shaw's playfulness with the form of theatre itself is taken to prefigure the arrival of absurdists like Beckett and Ionesco. But less noticed, it seems, is Shaw's underlying steel. Under the surface of the whole enterprise lies the extraordinary contention that it is not anyone's business to try and be happy, that happiness may only be a failure and a lure. Nothing in the play is more moving than Captain Shotover's reluctance to give way to what he calls the accursed happiness I have dreaded all my life long, the happiness that comes as life goes, the happiness of yielding and dreaming instead of resisting and doing, the sweetness of the fruit that is going rotten. Using a method which is notably Brechtian, strong characters turn out to be weak, rich characters turn out to be poor. Shaw explains with remorseless clarity how easily the wish to enjoy life turns us into a hopeless infatuation with dreams. He shows how each of us drifts off from the world into which we are born to dream far too easily of a world in which things might be different. No wonder this uncomfortable portrait of a society in which people are habitually distracted from their better purposes is one which theatregoers have occasionally found hard to contemplate. But they have not been helped by a common view of the play which emphasizes its frivolity and rhetoric at the expense of its deeper feelings. When I was fortunate enough to direct the play at the Almeida Theatre in London in 1997, with a cast that included Penelope Wilton, Richard Griffiths, Peter McHenry, Emma Fielding, and Patricia Hodge, it became clear that far from the governing tone of the play being either light-hearted or elegiac, it is, on the contrary, full of a feverishness that comes from genuine despair. My dazzling ensemble revealed that underneath the banter, underneath the central story of a young girl growing up in the course of a single evening, there lay a sense of wasted passion, which belies Shaw's reputation as a cold or cerebral writer. It has more of the miracle, more of the mystic belief in it than any of my others, wrote the author of his own favourite play. It also, he might have added, has more of the heart.
Thank you so much. What is so wonderful listening to you read that is it is so clear how much you love the play.
I love it.
You feel really defensive of it, don't you?
Yeah.
When people, exactly. So, I mean, it's a very, you started it in exactly the right place for Chichester in a way, is that Shaw is the second most performed playwright of all.
And why, do you think?
After Shakespeare. I think your point about the thrust stage, the sense of the democracy of the space, And the idea that at the very beginning of Chichester, it was about saying something from the stage, not just twiddling your fan and entertainment, meant that the second season there was St. Joan, and then the first time Heartbreak House was presented here was 1967, directed by Sir John Clements, and again in 2000. I mean, Heartbreak, this is its third time here. But I think maybe it's also that sense of the richness of language in this space from actors who can speak it that's what theatre's about, isn't it? I mean, it's just so big.
Yes, it simply went out of fashion. I mean, what I'm trying to say in the piece is it was always, It
was always thus.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, what's that? There's that wonderful line, you can quote it. What is it? It's in Privates on Parade, where one of the characters in Peter Nicholls' play about a variety show in the war, in the Malaya, says, "Ooh, that Bernadette Shaw, such a chatterbox she is." And so there's always been that feeling of, "Ooh, she's such a chatterbox, that Bernadette Shaw." And that's always been a sort of thing against. And of course, in the 1990s, there was a whole generation of playwrights who suddenly arrived and didn't want the theatre to be a place where there was what they dismissed as debate. Mm-hmm. They didn't want the theatre to be a place where there was a place of argument and discourse. They wanted a much more visceral theatre that was more like performance art than it was like a place where one person would say something and then somebody else would contradict them. But it's such a diminished view of Shaw to represent him as that. But The Burglar is the sort of most absurd. When I say he prefigures absurdism, then it's the beginning of that thing of not just satirizing the bourgeois, but actually turning bourgeois values upside down completely. The burglar has come in order to be discovered because he knows that a group of liberals will then give him money, because they'll take pity on him and say, "Oh, poor burglar," and give him money, right? And so you've got the basis of the Threepenny Opera. Hello, what's Bertolt Brecht doing in the Threepenny Opera except running away with exactly the same idea, namely that crime is organized and is the sort of it's just the mirror image of, bankers at the top, criminals underneath. Both sides know what they're doing. And, it's one's a mirror image of the other. And so there is an element of that is sort of the precursor of Ionesco and the whole fun of throwing ideas up in the air where people are the opposite of what they claim to be, and the ridiculous. And so it's so demeaning to say, "Oh, he just stands there and people have a debate." It is less like an edition of Question Time, Heartbreak House, than almost any play I know.
But it's also, I suppose, that idea which you obviously have wrestled with from critics all the way through, the idea of, is the business of playwriting political? And there was always that sort of sense that the politics, perhaps, that Shaw was a proponent of, had their day, which they manifestly haven't. But there was partly a debate about Shaw being dated a lot of the time, isn't there?
I think what happened was that, and it is a peculiar thing that you may not like about Shaw, which is that the impetus came from abroad. Undoubtedly, the impetus came from Ibsen. He read Ibsen, and it changed his life. And of course, Ibsen is a poet, primarily, and a poet of high seriousness. Those are very serious plays. I know they are thought by devotees of the theatre to have a humorous side to them, but I've never, clutched my sides at Ibsen. Strindberg, yes, I know Strindberg is now fashionably played for laughs, as if he intended them. I personally don't think Strindberg did intend the plays to be funny, but, there's a very famous story about Laurence Olivier having a catastrophic first preview of The Dance of Death, not here, but at the National Theatre, and people were laughing at him. They were laughing at him at The Dance of Death, which was very, very unexpected. And Kenneth Tynan came round to his dressing room and found him slumped, in despair. And he said, "Congratulations, Larry, you found the humour in Strindberg." and I think Olivier said, "Have I?" And then, being the brilliant theatre machine he was, by the second night he had firmly established that was his intention all along. That was exactly what he was trying to do. But, Ibsen and Strindberg were not thought to be a bundle of laughs, and yet the irrepressible Irishness, and we must remember he's Irish, the Irish humour of it he took the same social issues and added wit. And the wit is, we know he must have. We know from the few records we have of him meeting Oscar Wilde, he knew that Wilde was up to something completely radical and new and theatre-busting, and going further, if you like, than Shaw did, even in just saying all bourgeois morality is fake and it's all just a big charade, which obviously Wilde paid a much higher price for saying than Shaw did. And so Shaw can't resist letting the humour come through but it's based on on his reading of Ibsen.
When Shaw was writing Heartbreak House, is he, to your knowledge, the sort of writer that thought, this is the subject, now who can I hear to tell the story of this subject? Is it idea or character that
I think
comes
it's
first?
character, don't you?
I do, but I thought you would know.
I don't know.
I hoped you would know.
No, I actually don't know, but I know that the origin of the play, probably somebody here knows where Wyndham Croft is. I don't know, I'm afraid. Although I wrote a film about Virginia Woolf, I'm afraid to say I don't know where Wyndham Croft is. Does anyone know? But Wyndham Croft is the house.
It says North Sussex, doesn't it, in Shaw's own stage
But the
directions?
noise drifted. It did.
Yes.
It's not just on the South Downs. I think it was heard. But I know he began from that feeling, and then one of the things that I don't say about this play in that introduction is that it's always a fantastically happy play to perform, because everybody who is in it believes they have the best part. And it's very, very unusual that just as a technical piece of writing, the burglar doesn't necessarily believe they have the best part, but the other 9 do believe they have the best part. And everybody would go, oh, yes, it's all very good, that bit, but it's not so good until I come on and do such and such. Now, it is very, very rare, you will know, it's very rare for a company play to be a genuine company play like that. And in fact, when we had this Almeida ensemble playing it, then they came to me and said, could you write us all a play? Because we all get on so well, and we all love this idea that nobody has to carry the whole play, and that it's actually a group who play this play, and that everybody is happy with the lines they have got. Most of the time, most actors complain either that they have too small a part or too big a part. That's just a rule. You have the leading person, man or woman, who's saying, oh my God, I've got so much, I can't possibly deal with all this. And then you've got a whole lot of other people who are going, I'm bored stiff, I've only got, this. Actually, Shaw distributes it so beautifully. And I said to my group, it's technically beyond me to write a play in which everybody is satisfied with the part they've got like this.
And because often when you see those plays that have been deliberately written as ensemble, if they're narrative as opposed to accept, they never are. The story is somehow missing.
And there's a beautiful thematic thing where a character will be absent from the stage for a while, and then the ideas have moved, and then suddenly back will come the life as represented by the sister, who represents horsey England. And, the England that doesn't change, the Philistine England that loves horses and racing and is happiest mucking out stables. An England which still exists, and indeed within
Maybe you have answered the question why Shaw does so well in Sussex, who knows?
Yeah. Well, I was going to... it's very near here. I'm sure they're still mucking out the stables nearby. And, suddenly a critique of everything you've heard will be produced by a character who you've forgotten about for the last half hour, and they're back on stage. So what's moving all the time is both the ideas and the characters perfectly held together. And the third act, which, I don't want to spoil for anyone who's seen it, far from being, and is often spoken of as if it's sort of anomalous and overly bold and sort of silly, I think it works absolutely.
But it's
incredibly.
so magnificent, the way that everybody, little by little, except for the burglar, comes on, and it feels so democratic, the way that everybody has their moment in that final scene.
Yeah, and that is part of what he is also saying about life itself. He's a playwright who values people, and as a Democrat, he wants to give everybody their saying. And that doesn't mean he didn't write great plays with great leading parts. He did. But in this play, one of the things I love about it is that it's like the crystal is being turned all the time, and you see it from a different angle, according to who's speaking.
And actually, I was going to say extraordinarily modern, but sadly, it's not even the case, that the male and female roles are equivalent and equally important.
Yeah.
There isn't the sense of the supporting cast in the women or the men.
No.
And I enjoy that. Obviously, I enjoy that.
I think there is, and I do admit this, I think there is a slightly disfiguring foolishness in his attitude to women. I mean, in other words, it's not the women themselves and their representation. I get a little bit jumpy about as how pathetic the men are in the presence of the women and dealing with the women. And that's something you just have to deal with in Shaw, that because he himself was frightened, stupid by women, he had to be put up against a wall. And insofar as it is possible for a woman to rape a man, that was his first sexual experience at the age of 28, 29. Otherwise, he simply would never have done it, ever. And so he was frightened of women and also ludicrously romantic, because when he says the thing about staying at Virginia Woolf's house, he says, when I was staying at your house and, of course, falling in love with you. Well, there's very little record of relationship between George Bernard Shaw and Virginia Woolf. I don't think it's a very significant relationship in his life or hers. But it's that slight silliness about women that I do occasionally want to shake one or two of the characters and say, oh, grow up.
Yes, pull yourselves together. In terms of the importance of Heartbreak House, it not just within Shaw's work, but actually what was to follow in theatre after it was, it was written in 1916-17 and then performed pretty much straight after. Was it performed straight away after the war? Or 1921 or something? 21. So do you see it as an important play in terms of what was to follow in terms of writing in the theatre?
Yeah, I mean, I think Granville Barker is the sort of hidden figure behind all this. In other words, I don't think Granville Barker, I think I'm right in saying, and I know there are people here who know far more about Shaw than I do, but I think Granville Barker didn't direct Heartbreak House. I think Shaw directed it himself. Yes. And accounts of Shaw, I worked with Irene Worth, who of course had worked with Bernard Shaw, and she said he was like an old-fashioned stage manager. She said he just moved people around the stage and he didn't give instructions of any kind about interpretation. One of the problems with Shaw, and I had a laugh when I walked into this theatre, is that you have to do it the way he wrote it. If it says that the table is at the back, you have to put the table at the back. If you put the table at the front, you will just spend 4 weeks of rehearsal with nothing working at all. And he works in a Victorian toy theatre in his mind, and all the entrances and exits have to be, and they are, in identical places to where they were in my production, because there is actually only one way of doing his plays. And if you disobey, you just make ceaseless trouble for yourself. You can't reinterpret how he wants it. So what he's doing is getting it all fixed in his head. He's got all the moves fixed in his head, and he sat in the Royal Court stalls and just yelled out moves, and then he would leave it. But Granville Barker, behind him, so to speak, is aiming for a much more ambitious idea of the theatre director. And in fact, in Britain, is the originator of what we call the theatre director. He's somebody who's in charge of the interpretation, and he's somebody who's also insisting that theatre has a social purpose and that we're not just all there to be entertained, but that, by creating an event which is not just a staging of a play, but which is an interpretation of a play, you're going to be able to engage people more deeply.
And that's extraordinary, actually, in that the first time Heartbreak House was done here was directed by John Clements. It was his first season as the theatre director as well as directing the play. Sarah Bedell played Ellie Dunn, and Irene Worth was in that production.
Yeah.
And John Clements apparently used to move toy soldiers around at home in order to block and then come and speak.
That's it.
Exactly that. Do you think, though, that because...
I do think, just briefly about Irene Worth, because God, we should remember her today on the 50th anniversary of Chichester Festival, because she was one of the greatest actors I ever saw on a stage, and I just want to say so here at Chichester, because she was just a very great actor. But she had the best line. When I directed her in a play of mine, I said, I hope you don't mind, the fact of the author being at rehearsals all the time, and in this case, directing. And she said, oh, no, Shaw always came, Noel always came, and T.S. Eliot always came, she said. I thought, oh, well, I'm in a fair old line
company.
there. And I don't know any other actor who could have said that so insouciantly
Yes, exactly.
as Irene, just reeled them off.
But when I was reading the play, I was really surprised. I'd forgotten that there is sometimes a page and a half of stage directions,
that's right.
description. I mean, it's like a novel at the beginning of Heartbreak House. It is a page and a half of everything from the looking glass and the table. Is that maybe part of the issue, that there is much less space for a director or an interpreter to sort of interpose themselves make it new?
It may be that you can't, as it were...
But it's not how it feels to you.
Well, you can't set Rupert Gould to work, You can't say, let's open with, a fog and, let's have little green men come running in. You can't do any of that. You can't director it up, so to speak. It doesn't respond to that. But then that's not the only kind of directing in the world, is it?
No.
There are plays that do respond to that magnificently, but he's not doing that, is he?
No, but I mean, since you asked me the question at the beginning about why it isn't, I hadn't thought about Shaw not being done so much, because it is true that Chichester has always loved Shaw, and there have been many Shaw productions all the way through the 50 years. And so, actually, it was only reading your introduction, I thought, that's true. I've hardly seen Shaw anywhere else.
It's full of unexpected things, and it's one of the things I like about it is that the heart is in it, and that the heart is on his sleeve in a way that it isn't always. And the most wonderful thing about one production, which I'm not going to name because at least one of the people involved is still alive, but there was one production of Heartbreak House. In the third act, Shotover Ellie Dunn becomes, as it were, attached to Shotover, and he demands that Shotover, who is 89, sits with his arm round this 23-year-old girl, and she is just completely, gaga about this old man. And they sit on the bench together, and Shaw wants them to sit closely together. Well, in one production of this play, the wife of the actor playing Shotover took a private detective after seeing Act 3. And they set the private detective on the actress playing Ellie Dunn because the image was so potent of the actress in the arms of the older man that the actor's wife wrongly thought something must be going on. And she was serious too. And the actress was followed around for a while by the private detective. Yeah. And that's there in the play. That realism about desire and the heart is there. And the trick of the production, and it's a difficult play to do, it's not an easy play. A difficult play is to reach to those bass notes of feeling while you're also with the right hand playing all the talk, But both things are there.
But it's such an extraordinarily, I always think the scene on the bench, innocent moment.
Yeah.
I mean, almost the most innocent in the entire play.
Yeah.
Because there is no malice in that
No,
at
but
all.
it's also erotic because it's written by a 6-year-old man. Or, I don't know if he was, how old was he, but 1920, he's certainly in his 50s.
Yes, exactly. You mentioned Ellie Dunn. It's one of those roles often taken by an actor just starting on her career. Do you think it is one of those roles that makes a career, or is it so much just itself that it doesn't spread out, if you know what I mean?
Oh no, it's one of the great early parts you can play, isn't it? It's a fantastic part because the idea that in the course of an evening you learn, and you're meant to learn everything about life in the course of one evening. What more could an actor just out of drama school, sometimes, or sometimes more, sometimes older, But someone starting out, no, it's one of those great roles. Isn't it?
Why do you think that it was Shaw's favourite play? I mean, we all have favourites of our work, but why do you think it was his, for him?
I think because he found a way of revealing more of himself in a way that didn't embarrass him. I think that he tends to undercut himself in some of the plays. And obviously in the character of Henry Higgins, this man who's absolutely terrified of feeling and terrified of revealing anything about himself. And somehow through this articulation of eight or nine people, I think Shaw could show more of himself and a warmer side of himself than you sometimes see. So he doesn't come across in the play at all as a sort of cold old stick. He comes across as a man full of feeling and terrible, terrible anguish about this feeling, which I think he describes in the play, of life slipping away through your fingers. And that is the dominant feeling of the play, what I describe about we'll eat but we won't live. The dominant feeling of the play is it's all passing and we're all missing it. And it's going by and we're not taking hold of it. And Shotover is so moving because he's still trying to take hold of it.
And you mentioned in your introduction this sense of the quite extraordinary level of prophecy in the play, in a way. The sense that many of the things that Shaw's characters speak about, the love of money for no purpose, everybody being slightly dissatisfied, even if they're chasing a certain sort of dream, that the industrialists are going to have it their way rather than the dreamers and the adventurers. Do you think that he, when he's writing, is consciously thinking what will be, or he's actually just looking inside and thinking...
I don't know, it's interesting, because of course it's interesting seeing it revived now.
Yes.
It's interesting seeing it after the financial crisis, and it feels completely different. You know, it feels completely different from how it did 12 years ago. But I think that what I like is, and the play is very reminiscent of Howard's End. It's very hard not to watch it and to think about Forster, who is not maybe he is a contemporary, he lives a little late. He's later, isn't he? And he lives a little later. He's an Edwardian, really. And so, when Forster is theoretically writing about the same subject, which is the division between the new commercial class and the old bohemians, in Howard's End, he's much more mimsy about it and much more sort of yuckily sentimental about it. Forster sort of forgives, he sort of forgives both sides. He forgives the Schlegels and he forgives the, can't remember,
Neither can I.
What are they called, the other side? The people who are all telegrams and anger, as he calls them. They're sort of forgiven by the author, which I always slightly go, oh, put yourself away. Nobody's interested in whether you forgive them or not. We'll be the judge of that, is what I feel, in the great words of the Daily Mail. So it's for us to judge them. Whereas Forster does this, I'm a humanist writer, and therefore I'm going to forgive them all. And Shaw doesn't do that, and I admire him for that. Shaw's much more, he's tougher on his characters, and he doesn't, as it were, let the whole play sink in a sentimental quagmire.
Yes,
which Howard's End slightly does, I think.
Do you feel as a writer or as a director that you not owe a debt to Shaw, but do you see his influence in your work, or do you think it's a completely different sort of a beast?
No, I mean, the only thing is that we owe to him and we owe to Granville Barker the notion that theatre should be publicly subsidised, and that it is a mark of a cultivated society, that it pays for an art form, and that's what it is, that would not otherwise survive, and that wouldn't be able to survive. And, the story of Chichester, my God, Chichester held out long enough against subsidy. It would not exist now without subsidy, because what Chichester wants to do is not possible now without subsidy. And so that notion that theatre was an art form and not an entertainment, which does critically come from Shaw and Granville Barker, he made it, in that sense, he made it possible for everybody. But his dramatic technique, no, I don't feel.
You don't feel the blending of
No.
politics and
No.
Narrative is
No. And I don't also think that, he was programmatic, sure. He was half polemical journalist as well as playwright, and, he's working to schemes and ideas and schedules and strategies and party programs in his head, which have never troubled me. I've never been a member of a party or subscribed to a program, So it's a completely different way of writing.
And it's Shaw's favourite of his plays. You read the introduction so beautifully. Is it your favourite of Shaw's plays?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
I think Pygmalion is an incredible play.
Yeah.
I do think Pygmalion is just... And I think I think when the National Theatre did its... it got everyone to vote on what the greatest plays of the century were. And Peter Pan comes first, of course. But I think Pygmalion is the loved play of Shaw's, isn't it? It's right up there, and I don't know, in the top 10 somewhere as one of the 10 most, because it is a portrait of a certain kind of England and English person that is just absolutely emotionally spot on, isn't it? And so that's the one that will always be more popular. But I think Heartbreak House is the most profound.
So when we started talking, you mentioned Uncle Vanya, you mentioned Brecht, of course, the resistible rise of Arturo Ui across the way. And we're sitting here now on the 50th anniversary season. And, of course, Heartbreak House and Vanya and Way of the World. There are very many plays and actors and directors who are here as part of the story of the 50 years of CFT. So can you remember when you first came here and what you first saw?
Yes, the reason I wanted to do this talk in here was to sit on this stage. And that's why I wanted to do it, because it meant so much to me as a schoolboy. And I saw Vanya with Redgrave and Olivier. I think I probably saw it in the second season. I think I saw it when it came back and was this established phenomenon. And I saw St. Joan in the same season, sure. And so, we came in a school party to see it. And I would like to say, this is something I really want to say. If you go to YouTube, you can download the filmed record of Olivier and Michael Redgrave in the whole thing is there. Whether it's there legally or not, I don't know. It may be illegal. But I watched it a few weeks ago. And we all believe that there are fashions in acting. We all say, oh, if we now saw Henry Irving, he'd be ridiculous. If Sarah Bernhardt gave her Hamlet tonight, we'd all laugh it off the stage, Fashions in acting change. Theatre acting in particular is just at an accepted level of stylization. These levels of stylization change. And I've subscribed to this myth and gone, oh, yeah. You see Michael Redgrave and Laurence Olivier in Uncle Vanya. If you put it on the stage tonight, it would be absolutely fresh as a daisy. There is nothing they do which would disturb the modern audience in any way, right? Michael Redgrave is giving a psychological performance of such complexity and modernity that you just would say, well, I see, this is the greatest performance I've seen, in this role. And Olivier, always represented to us as a show person, etc., he's directed this production. He's giving an Astroff which is so counter the modern sentimentality. The modern sentimentality about Astroff is that, of course, because he's an environmentalist, he must be a good person, right? Olivier's having none of this, He's playing the man as an outright shark, terrible to women, treats them appallingly, shifty, unreliable, like Chekhov himself, wants to sleep with them once and then never talk to them ever again. And, Olivier's giving this really, but, of course, he loves the trees, but just because he loves the trees, that doesn't make him a good person. And this sort of sentimentality now, which I find unbearable, not talking about the Vanya we saw here, but I've seen a few Vanyas where, oh, he loves trees, so he's a very good person. That Olivier is not having any of. And there is in his performance, there's a physicality, just as you think about the famous thing of him standing on the table in Long Day's Journey into Night and changing the light bulb, but this incredible physical address he had. But there's no showing off, there's no display. There's a moment where he just gets up and sits on the table in this one. He sits on the dining room table. And the way he sits, he's not showing off. He's just so eloquent with his body about what this person is feeling at that moment. And it's all in the line of the caricature of the body. And it's physicality not for display, but physicality to express character. And I can't recommend it to you highly enough. It's brand new. And you just go, well, 50 years may have gone by, but not actually in terms of what great acting is about, actually.
I mean, I often ask, many of you are familiar faces. How many of you did see that Vanya, who are here this evening?
Yeah.
Yeah, so...
Well,
and you are the lucky ones, you see. It's awful for the rest of us who didn't, because we keep being told about this. And last night with the critics panel, it was very interesting that both Michael Billington and Nicholas de Jong had, felt that having seen that particular, they weren't sure it was 62 or 63, I think they were 62, that it was fundamental to the choices they subsequently made in terms of being
in their
involved,
lives?
In their lives, in terms of being involved in theatre and understanding that it was transforming, not just a couple of hours and an ice cream in the interval.
Yeah.
Do you remember feeling that? Is that what
No,
you
I
felt?
didn't feel that. For me, that was seeing Paul Schofield as Lear. And so when I saw Paul Schofield as King Lear, that really did make me think, oh, this is a profession I would like to be involved in. But I think that was to do with that particular play. Vanya, inevitably, if you're young, it's not a play that speaks to you, maybe, as, I don't know, for myself. I loved it when I saw it, and this acting just seemed to me sublime and beyond anything I'd ever seen. But Lear as a play spoke to me the first time I saw it, and I was lucky enough to see it for the first time with Paul Schofield.
Yes, well, that's another one of those. That's an Irene Worth moment, isn't it?
Exactly,
yes, exactly. Have we got time for some questions, Rupert?
Probably two or three.
2 or 3 questions. Right, whack your hands in the air if you want to be one of those 2 or 3. Gentleman at the back.
So why do you think the play is called Heartbreak House?
Oh, because there's a line, isn't there, about it's a house that, I can't remember what the line is, but it's a house that breaks hearts. And it's because of this idea that everybody is motored by unreasonable dreams. Do you see? That was the basic idea, that we all dream of something that's completely, we long for, but which we have no practical means of achieving. And so that may be a person, it may be an idea, it may be an ambition, it may be a career, it may be something, and we want that thing. And when you come to this house, you realize that you're never going to get it. You're never going to get the thing you dream of. And it's a place that breaks dreams, is the idea.
Yeah. Thank you. Another question. Lady there.
You were talking about women, I'm sure. How did Ellen Terry affect that? Did she stand him up against the wall and make him?
I only have details of one seduction, I'm afraid. I can't
You're letting us down here, David.
I can't fill you in on the rest of them. But plainly, women found him provocative precisely because he was such an evader of women. Unlike Chekhov, Chekhov, who we're talking about, Chekhov was predatory. He was predatory on women, but the minute he had conquered them, he withdrew. And Chekhov drove them mad because of that, which is, there's nothing worse than, you get together for the first time and then boom, he's off. He doesn't speak to you ever again. That's Chekhov. But it's Shaw people fascinated by him and women trying to pull him into their world. But he really, I don't think sexuality was terribly important to Shaw.
It was easier for them just to write letters to each other. Easier for them just to write letters to each other.
Exactly. And fantasize. And that remark to Virginia Woolf, where I fell in love with you, it's just so shallow, isn't it?
It's that idea of charm.
Yeah,
yes, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, we're having this romance, but What is that remark of D.H. Lawrence's about? I'm sure he was talking about Shaw when he said, the British have sex in the head, which is the worst place to have it.
I think he'd be quite happy with the internet, but true, actually. Is there a last question? Perfect. In which case, I mean, that is a perfect time to bring it to a close. You all know that there will be many more of these talks to come. The post-performance talk of Heartbreak House, which of course has Derek Jacobi and a wonderful ensemble cast playing this wonderful play on this superb set, is on Thursday, the 2nd of August. If you want something a little bit earlier, we have Brecht in Cabaret this Sunday at 8 o'clock in the wonderful Theatre on the Fly. And I don't know if anybody's yet been into the sort of temporary third structure, but it's only here this time, and when it is dismantled, it won't be put up anywhere else. So do go in there and feel how very different the atmosphere is in for the sort of writing that's in there. The next play that's going to open there is Playhouse Creatures on the 19th. And that is going to be in conversation, a pre-performance talk on the 25th with the playwright, who is April de Angelis, with the director, Michael Oakley. I'm back here next Thursday with Gareth Valentine, who is the musical director of Kiss Me Kate. And if any of you have not got a moment that you just don't know what to do with yourselves, because there's nothing left at CFT tonight in Theatre on the Fly, at 9:45, ladies and gentlemen, there is a silent disco. Now, just imagine how very cool you're all going to sound if you go to a silent disco in a tent in the park. But it just remains for me, therefore, to say an enormous thank you to my favourite playwright, David Hare.
Thank you.